So now we're going to look at some problems with prototype clustering. Uh, some with k-means like choosing a priori the number of clusters we can solve with other algorithms, for example affinity propagation, which I'm going to talk in some detail. And then we're also going to look at a different approach, which is density based clustering. And finally, I'm going to talk a bit about clustering validation. So this is to give you this week, before we start looking at other types of algorithms, just an overview of different approaches and a basic idea of how to validate clusters. So we saw with k-means an example of prototype-based clustering. This is a type of clustering where we select some examples or some vectors in the same feature space as the examples, as happens with k-means, to represent the clusters by becoming a prototype for the whole cluster. So in this case, k-means, we have these centroids, the mean points for our clusters, and we assign points to those clusters that have the centroid closer to the point. So this results in a partition like this, where all points that would fall over on this region would be closer to this centroid, so they would belong to the blue cluster. All the points here on this region would be closer to this centroid, so they would be on the red cluster, and so on. This is good for globular clusters with similar dispersion, because if you have points distributed like this, if you find the correct number of centroids, then you get a very good clustering of these points, but only if you find the correct number of centroids. For example, if we have the same distribution of points, but we try to cluster them into 2 clusters instead of 3, then we get something that is not very good. It's not good, the k-means algorithms, it's not good for clusters that are not globular. For example, here we have 3 clusters that have this spread out shape, and in this case it's a bit more problematic, because even if we use 3 centroids, we get these strange clusters here because of the distances between the points and the centroids. So this is not necessarily a bad thing about k-means when you are, for example, using things like vector quantization, because you really need to be able to specify the number of centroids and let them distribute throughout the points. So it depends on the application that you want. But if you want to just to try to figure out the natural structure of the data, then k-means can be problematic. For example, also when you have clusters that have different variances. For example, these clusters are very tight and this one is more spread out. But since the attribution of points to clusters is based on the distance to the centroid, then there is always a frontier exactly in the midpoint between 2 centroids. So even though this cluster here is more spread out than the red one here, the frontier is here in the middle of this cloud, because it has to be exactly halfway between the 2 centroids here. These points are closer to this centroid, these points are closer to this one. So if your clusters have different sizes, k-means does not work very well because of this, because of the way of assigning points to the clusters. So there are some problems here on this type of clustering with prototypes, that we have a fixed number of prototypes. We have these distance measures like this that may result in problems if the clusters are not globular, if the clusters have different variances, and so on. But they also may be useful in some applications. So in vector quantization, for example, these characteristics of k-means are exactly what we want to achieve those purposes. So we cannot really say that a clustering algorithm is good or bad. It all depends on what we are trying to use it for. But let's see an algorithm that is based on prototypes but solves the problem of having to pre-specify the number of clusters. This is affinity propagation. So the details of the mathematics in the algorithm are a bit complex. We're not going to focus too much on them, but I want to give you an intuitive notion of how the algorithm works. So we have these three matrices. They they are matrices for the with the same number of columns and the same number of rows as the examples we have. So they relate all the different examples. And we have this first similarity matrix that measures the similarity between all pairs of examples. The similarity is something that is symmetrical to the distance, for example, so you can use minus the distance for the similarity. This means that a very low similarity will correspond to a very high distance and vice versa. And we can use the diagonal, so the similarity of a point to itself, as the propensity for being a prototype. So if we put a very negative value on the diagonal of this similarity matrix, we are saying that we want our points to be very reluctant to be representatives of clusters, and this results in fewer clusters. If we give a higher value, then we have more clusters because the points are more likely, have a larger propensity for becoming prototypes of clusters. Now we have two matrices that one covers the responsibility of one point sending to another. So basically point I is telling point K that point K is suitable or responsible for representing point I. We can think of this as a sort of a vote for representatives. And then we have availability of K to represent I. So this A matrix gives us the availability that the representative has to represent each of the other points. So basically we can think of this as the points passing messages to one another, saying that I want you to represent me, and the other one saying I am available or not to represent you. And the algorithm proceeds by passing these messages until it reaches convergence, and we have points that represent other points, and so they become prototypes of clusters. So the algorithm starts by initializing R and A to 0, so the representativity and availability, the responsibility and availability starts at 0, and we only have the similarity matrix. So now we start by updating the responsibility by looking at the similarities and subtracting the similarities to other points. So initially availability is 0. So basically what we're doing is that the responsibility of K as a representative of I is the similarity between the two minus the maximum similarity to some other potential representative. So we're going to look at other potential representatives, and if some other one has an even larger similarity, then I will not want to be represented by K. It will prefer to go to the other one. So basically we can think of this as point I, choosing which one of the other points seems to be more suited as representative of I. And this initially only takes into account the similarity between them, but eventually it also takes into account how much the candidate is available as a representative. So then we update the availability by looking at the self-responsibility, so how a point is somewhat propense to be a representative of other points, and then looking also at the propensity for representing different points. So basically a point is available if it's a good representative, not only by itself but also by the relations to other points, and this we can create this self responsibility by looking at the maximum of the representative of K for all the other points, of the responsibility of K for representing all the other points. So basically what we're trying to measure here is how, from the perspective of K, it feels as being available to represent different points. So this is the basic idea. We have points assigning responsibility to others for representing them, and we have the points looking at how available they are to represent the different points. And we go proceed the iteration by passing on these messages between the points. And now we can try to identify the clusters by looking at for each point I, which is the point that has the maximum total availability and responsibility with respect to I. If this is a point that is different from I, then I will choose that other point K as its representative. So I will belong to the cluster of prototype K. But if this one, the one with the maximum, is the same as I, then the point is itself a prototype. It will be the representative of a cluster. So by doing this, we can look at what happens during the iteration. Suppose that we start with these points. Initially, nearly all points are representatives of themselves, so we have almost as many clusters as points. But then we start having these points that choose others to be their representatives. So this is a very small cluster of 2 points. This one does not think it's a representative, but is represented by that one. And now, as we carry on the iteration, we start having more clusters, more points in clusters, and then start having fewer clusters. But this is not necessarily monotonical. We can reach one stage, for example, where we only have 2 clusters, but then some points here will, by receiving those messages, will start to become representatives of other points and so on. And eventually, this converges to a fixed set of clusters. So this is how affinity propagation works, and we do not specify initially how many clusters we want. However, because the self-similarity here, the diagonal of the similarity matrix will determine the propensity for being for the responsibility and so on. So it will determine the propensity of becoming prototype for a cluster. It will affect the number of clusters in the end. So this is one example where we do not determine exactly how many clusters we are going to have in the end. This will depend on the data, but it also depends on the parameters that we set. So by changing those parameters, we change the number of clusters we have at the end. This gives us an automatic number of K, but it's still based on prototypes and those dissimilarities. So if the dissimilarity, if the similarity is based on distance, for example, we have effects like this. So these points, since they are close to those points there, they may have some representative somewhere here, and they all vote on that representative, even though these points would more naturally belong to this cloud here rather than this part. But affinity propagation is not looking at these kinds of structures here. It's just looking at the similarities to representatives. So it still has this basic problem of prototype-based clustering that we, depending on the shapes of the clusters, we can have these clusterings that are that do not correspond well to the structure of the data. To use affinity propagation with scikit-learn, you have this class in the cluster module called affinity propagation. You have these parameters damping, the number of maximum iterations and so on. These affect the convergence and stopping criteria. So they are mostly for the computation itself and not for the specification of the clusters. But then when you use affinity, you can use a pre-computed matrix. You can set manually the preference, so the diagonal of the matrix, or leave it on automatic. So you can look at the documentation for these different options. And then you have these attributes. For example, the cluster centers indexes tells you which examples are serving as prototypes. The labels are the labels for the examples that we use to fit the model, the affinity matrix, and so on. So you can look at these data. For example, the affinity matrix, you can give one pre-computed, so you can assign here an array with all the affinities, or if you use, for example, Euclidean, then it will be the negative of the distance and the diagonal will be pre-computed automatically, and so on. So this is how you can use affinity propagation easily with scikit-learn. Now let's look at the different approach to clustering, which is based on density. dbScan is this density-based spatial clustering of applications with noise, and the idea here is that we consider points to be core points if they have at least a minimum number of neighbors. And neighbors are all those points that are within some distance epsilon. So these are the two parameters that we define in dbScan. The distance that specifies the neighborhood of each point, this epsilon, and the minimum number of points required for a point to be a core point. And this notion of core points is what is going to determine the clusters, because now the algorithm consists of visiting each point and counting the number of neighbors within the epsilon distance of each point P. And there are two options here. One is that the number of neighbors is below the minimum, and that means P is now presumed to be noise. It may not be noise, but at this point we assume that is noise because it's on a lower density region of our data. If not, if the number of neighbors within epsilon distance of P is at least the minimum number of points, then P is part of a cluster. And now we create a cluster with the core point P, and all of the neighbors will be added to this cluster. So all of these neighbors will be added to the cluster of core point P. If one of the neighbors is also a core point, that is, if one of these neighbors Q also has at least this minimum number of neighbors, then clusters P and Q are merged into a single one. So if any core point is neighbor of another core point, these will form the same cluster, will be merged into the same cluster. Now the result of this, when we follow all the points, is something like this. If we have these data, these will be part of one cluster because we have lots of core points here that are neighbors to each other, and they force all of these initial clusters to merge together into one single cluster. This is another cluster here, and these points in low density regions will be left without being assigned to any cluster. So these are noise points. There may be points here that are not core points, that do not have enough neighbors, but since they have one core point as neighbor, they are pulled into the cluster of that core point. But points that are further away and in lower density regions do not belong to any cluster. So this can handle noise, and it's not prototype based, because note that the core points here, so these points with the white circles are core points because they have at least that number of neighbors. They are not exactly prototypes because the membership of each point to this cluster is not determined by any of these points individually. Rather, each point, even the non-core points, belong to the cluster because they have a core point as neighbor, but all these core points belong to the same cluster because they have a network of neighbors between them that brings them all together in the same cluster. And the same thing for the blue cluster here. So this density-based clustering avoids some problems with prototype-based clustering. Basically, this issue of assigning points to a cluster that is closer together, or the prototype is closer together. Since we don't have that problem, we can easily find that this is one cluster and this is one cluster here. And it also handles noise, so it leaves out all those points in low density. Of course, for some applications, this will not work. You cannot use, for example, dbScan to do vector quantization like we did with the image example, because it would just create a single cluster with all those points, and that would not be very useful. So for dbScan with scikit-learn, you have here the dbScan class. Eps is the epsilon value, so the distance for the neighborhood. Min samples is the minimum number of points, and this is how the distance is calculated. So this can be either a matrix of distances that you supply for all the pairs of points, a function that you can supply that given 2 points gives you the distance, or you can just use the default Euclidean and it will compute the Euclidean distance. And then you have the sample indices, so this will be so the labels, and the core sample indices are the which points in your data when you fit are core points. The labels are the labels for the different clusters, where -1 is used to indicate noise. So -1 is not a cluster, it indicates that those points were not assigned to any cluster. Okay, so now now that we saw different algorithms for clustering, let's take a look at how we can evaluate clusters to see if our clusters are good or not. In supervised learning, we have this immediate, obvious measure, which is measuring the error. Since we know what the target value should be, we can measure the difference between what our model, our hypotheses are predicting and the target value, and then we can select the best hypothesis or measure how good the hypothesis is. For clustering, this is a bit harder because it depends on what we want to do. So a good clustering will depend on what we want to use it for. And we have different contexts. If we want to determine whether or not the data has some structure, if we want to determine the number of clusters, if we want to see if these clusters fit the data well without looking at external information, so just by the distribution of the features, or if it fits some known labeling of the data. So we can actually compare our clustering with some external indexes that tell us what groups each example should belong to. Or we can even compare different clusterings. We can see how similar they are or different they are. So for internal validation, when we don't have reference to external data, external indexes or other clusters, we can use some measures to try to estimate how good our clustering is. So cohesion, which means how close together are the examples within each cluster. Separation, how far apart the clusters are. Some measures of cohesion can be, for example, the sum of the squares distances or the square error within each cluster. And then we have this silhouette score that tries to look at cohesion and separation using Euclidean distances. So we'll see this as examples. The idea of the cohesion of one cluster will be the similarity of pairs of points inside the cluster summed up for all the pairs of points in the cluster. So for all x and y belonging to one given cluster, cluster I, we add up the similarity of all these points. So the more similar they are, the points that belong to the cluster, the larger the cohesion value of the cluster. Of course, if you are looking at distance instead of similarity, then you need to adjust this. For example, the cohesion will be higher the smaller the distance summed for all the points in the clusters, or you could use a measure of similarity like taking, for example, the negative of the distance, something like that. Separation between clusters will be given by the similarity between the points of one cluster and points of another cluster. So if when we look at all the pairs of points between one cluster and the other, and they tend to be very similar, then our clusters are not well separated. If they have low similarity or large difference, then our clusters are well separated. All of this will depend exactly on the measure that you use, but this is the general idea. Cohesion means similarity within the clusters. Separation means dissimilarity or difference between the clusters. If you are using prototype-based clusters, where we assign points to clusters based on their distance to the prototype, then we can simplify this, and we can use for cohesion simply adding the similarity between all the points in the cluster and the prototype, the centroid, for example. And for separation, we can look just at the distance or the similarity between the prototypes. But this would be a special case for prototype-based clusters. But the most important thing here is this idea of validating cluster or evaluating clusterings by looking at how cohesive, how tight the clusters are, and how well separated they are from one another. So if you have distance, for example, you can actually use this sum of squares error, for example, using the quadratic, the square of the distance between the points and the prototype, for example, as we saw previously. But this silhouette score tries to bring together these two ideas of cohesion and separation. So we take this value A for point I of being the average distance between I and all points in the same cluster. So this, we measure the distance of I and all points that belong to the same cluster of I, and we average that. And B is the average distance of I to all points in the nearest cluster, so the cluster that has the smallest average distance to I. And now the silhouette score is the difference between B and I, so B minus I, divided by the maximum of, B minus A, divided by the maximum of A and B. So basically this is a value that can range from -1 to 1. And if it's -1, it means that the average distance to points outside the cluster, in the nearest cluster, is smaller than the average distance to points in the same cluster. And this becomes negative, and it can approach -1 if, for example, this is close to 0 and this one is dominating the term. So in this case, this will be divided by A here, and we get a -1 for the silhouette score. If the distance, the average distance within the same cluster is very low compared to the distance to the nearest cluster, then this term will become close to 1, and a silhouette score, so this ratio here will become close to 1 because B now is dominating here and here. And so when the silhouette score is close to 1, we get clusters that are very cohesive and well separated from one another. So we can use the silhouette score as an easy way to assess how good our clusters are, assuming that we want clusters to be cohesive and well separated. This is easy to use because you have this metrics module in scikit-learn. You have the silhouette score. You just need to provide the coordinates of your points, so the data, the features, and the labels for the clusters, and this function automatically computes these average distances to the nearest cluster and within the cluster and so on, and gives you the average silhouette score for all the points in this data set. So some examples: if you have a clustering like this, so red, blue, and green, these three clusters, they are considerably cohesive and separated from one another, and this silhouette score is pretty close to 1, 0.73. If you make a mistake, for example, in choosing the number of clusters, and you have this clustering, then you see the silhouette score is now reduced, because now we have a cluster here where we have points that are very far apart, and they may actually be close to points in the other cluster. So when we average the silhouette score for all these points, we get a lower overall score for this clustering. If you have something like this, which is not a very good clustering at all, then the silhouette score is even lower, because now we have different clusters in these clouds of points, where we have points that are very close together and belong to different clusters. Then we have points that belong to the same cluster but are very far apart, and so the silhouette score starts to drop in this case. It's also it can show you some problems when you have these kinds of issues where some clusters are more spread out than the others, and so you can have these frontiers here. But when you have clusters of different sizes, the silhouette score may also not work very well, because now the distances within the cluster may start to become higher, even though it makes sense to put those points in the same cluster. And this is especially problematic when your clusters are not compact clusters. Because if you use the silhouette score for clusters like this, for example, you get a very low value, even though these clusters are perfectly good. So these, if you are looking at density-based clustering, this makes sense. But when you average the distances within the cluster and between different clusters, then you get this low silhouette score, because you have points that are very far apart in the same cluster, and you have pairs of points that are close together between different clusters, so this gives you a low silhouette score. So basically, these internal indexes will depend on what you are looking for in the clusters. The silhouette score is a very widely used internal index for evaluating clusterings, but you need to remember that it's looking at mostly globular clusters that are far from each other. That would be the ideal for having a high silhouette score. If your clusters are of different shapes and different sizes and things like that, then silhouette score may not work that well. Then we have these external indexes where we can do something similar to supervised learning, where we are comparing the clusters with some known labels or some known structure of the data, or we can have these relative indexes where we compare clusters to other clusterings. We're going to talk a bit more about that next week. And because next week I'm going to give you what you need to know to start the assignment, I will put the assignment online during the weekend, and then we'll talk a bit about these validation issues a bit more. But basically the message I wanted to leave here is that validation of clusterings is not an easy problem. It's very hard because it depends on our ability to quantify and formalize what we want the clusters to be used for. And this can be very difficult because often we are using clustering when exploring data and we don't have a good idea of what we want. And even if we do have a good idea, we may not be able to specify how to quantify it. So validating clustering is far from trivial. So to sum up for today, we looked at another type of prototype-based clustering. So we saw k-means on the previous lecture, affinity propagation on this one. Affinity propagation does not need you to specify exactly how many clusters you're going to have, but you will affect the number of clusters by the parameter you give to the diagonal of the similarity matrix, which tells the algorithm how propense the points are to become prototypes of clusters. In density-based clustering with dbScan, you also do not specify the number of clusters, but depending on the parameters of the mean number of points, minimum number of points, and the epsilon, this will influence the number of clusters that you have in many cases. So remember that even algorithms that do not need you to specify the number of clusters, they do not necessarily result in a number of clusters that is only dependent on the data. It will also be dependent on the criteria you specify for creating clusters, so you have some influence in the number of clusters that appear. We saw a brief overview of unsupervised cluster validation, so looking at the internal metrics of the clusterings we create. We are going to look a bit more on this supervised cluster validation, or at least a comparison with external labels next week. So for affinity propagation, if you want to look into more detail, you have the algorithm here in this paper. For density, for dbScan, you have the paper here. But you should take a look at the scikit-learn documentation on clustering. You have many examples and explanations of the different parameters that you can use. So that's it for today. I'm going to log in to Zoom and we can talk a bit on the Zoom session. See you soon.